I want to talk about a move that the US has just made that, at the very least, raises some interesting questions about where the situation with Iran might be heading next. And if the US does decide to use force against Iran, it's worth considering that it may not look like some of the more recent limited strikes we've seen in the past. Now, the move I'm referring to is the deployment of the US Air Force's newest wide area or theater level electronic warfare EW aircraft across the Atlantic to Ramstein Air Force Base in Germany. The aircraft is called the EA-37B Compass Call, and it isn't a traditional strike aircraft in the conventional sense. It doesn't drop warheads on foreheads. It's a highly specialized electronic warfare asset that is designed to disrupt and degrade an opponent's ability to coordinate its forces. So we're talking about communication, we're talking about command and control structures, we're talking about data links, sensor suites, radar, those sort of things, typically done as part of a much broader operation. So on its own, this doesn't really mean that a strike is imminent. The US moves military assets around the world all the time. But when you look at what this aircraft is designed to do and where it's been positioned, it does raise a reasonable question around what military planners might be planning. Ramstein is the largest US base in Europe, and it's a major logistics and staging hub that connects Europe with CENTCOM adjacent theaters, including the Middle East. So it's not typically where you would expect to see or expect to send a niche asset unless it's supporting something much larger. And the timing also matters. This deployment coincides with a much broader shift in US posture towards Iran. So we've seen the USS Abraham Lincoln carrier strike group being deployed to the region. There's also been public rhetoric between the US and Iranian officials sharpening quite a lot, with Iranian officials talking about any action that gets taken against Iran will be considered to be war. So taken together, this looks a lot less like routine signaling and more like positioning, even if the end state remains unclear. Now, something to bear in mind is that carrier strike groups do have a tactical level airborne EW aircraft as part of their air wing. And these are the EA-18G Growlers. It's based on the FA-18. We saw reports of these aircraft being used to support the US's detention of President Maduro from Venezuela. So when you hear these accounts from Venezuela's of their whole air defense system being taken offline, communications being unavailable, this is a classic example of electronic warfare being used. So the forward deployment of the EA-37B Compass Call adds a strategic theater-level electronic warfare that usually only makes sense if planners are thinking beyond a limited localized strike. You don't deploy wide-area EW assets unless you're expecting an opponent to still be fighting after the first wave. This doesn't obviously prove that a major strike is coming, but it does suggest that planners are preparing for something beyond a symbolic blow and to something a lot more complex. But before we go sort of further into that, I kind of want to take a step back and just look at how Iran got to the stage that it is at the moment currently, because the things have deteriorated in the country quite significantly over the last 2 months. So from late November into mid-December, Iran's economic situation deteriorated rapidly. We saw the rial losing a significant part of its value, and obviously with that, inflation accelerated. We saw shortages of basic goods. Wage arrears started to appear across public and semi-state sectors, meaning lots of people were simply not being paid. And obviously, and as all of this built together, we saw labor actions starting to appear. We saw a little bit of unrest, protests, things like that. Teachers, transport workers, oil-linked industries showed signs of unrest. And what's notable here is that it wasn't confined to one sector or city. It was pressure building across multiple layers of society. And things escalated on 28th of December when shopkeepers in Tehran's Grand Bazaar closed en masse. So the whole of the Grand Bazaar. This matters historically because bazaar closures in Iran have long been a warning sign for regimes. And the obvious irony here is that the bazaar played a decisive role in the 1979 revolution that actually brought the current regime into power. So after this, protests started to spread throughout the city, across all levels of society. And compared to other protest waves from previous years, this one expanded a lot faster and drew in a wider cross-section of society. So we saw workers, merchants, students, professionals, and even the police in some areas taking part in the protests. Reports also indicated that violence escalated far earlier than in previous protest cycles, and I'm talking about violence from the security forces in trying to quell the protests and the unrest. So we saw internet blackouts, we saw arrests, we saw deaths at the hands of security forces, all against the backdrop of the economy deteriorating. So in earlier protests in Iran, a lot of them had been caused by single events. There would have been things like the fuel price increasing or a death in detention by the security forces, things like that. And the response by the state was predictable. It was often very limited. It was violence, internet outages, arrests, limited concessions. But what makes this different is that it's not just the level of violence. It's Iran experiences violent crackdowns by the state. It's that there wasn't a single trigger. The trigger was the slow failure of the system, of the economy itself. Wages going unpaid, the bazaar shutting down, shortages of essential goods, accelerated inflation, loss of purchasing power, the protests spreading faster than the state could isolate them. And then obviously with that, there's this disproportionately violent response from the state. And when you look at this, it doesn't look like isolated dissent. It's a systemic problem and a systemic failure. Now, something worth remembering is that authoritarian systems rarely fail because they lose the ability to use force. They typically tend to fail when force becomes the only thing that's holding them together. They can't offer concessions to citizens because there's nothing left to give. They only hold on to power by force, and at some point, people stop fearing that. They stop fearing the government. They stop fearing the force, the police, the army, and they just express themselves. As the crackdown by the security forces inside Iran intensified, we saw international reaction starting to ratchet up. Human rights organizations called for pressure on the Iranian government. Several governments with citizens inside Iran issued advisory notices to leave now. We saw other countries reducing embassy staffing or moving operations outside of Tehran. Sorry. So now, embassy drawdowns aren't a definitive, proof that the war is inevitable, but they do suggest that those governments are taking some degree of risk management, and which brings us then to the deployment of the EA-37B, and what it might tell us in terms of the kind of scenarios that the US might be planning for. So why might the US be considering even striking Iran at this moment? I think from Washington's point of view, this isn't just about the protests. It's about a convergence of long-standing strategic concerns and what may be a moment of unusual vulnerability from inside the Iranian system. The Iranian regime appears politically exposed in a way that it hasn't been for a long time. Public hostility isn't just focused on a single grievance or a single issue, but on sustained economic failure. And when unrest cuts across multiple social groups, it becomes a lot harder to contain. The repression becomes more visible to the international community, which further erodes whatever legitimacy the regime had. And this is obviously domestically as well as internationally. Iran's regional role is also central. We have to remember that they continue to support groups that challenge the US allies in the region, and obviously attempt to destabilize the region. So we're talking about Hamas and Hezbollah against Yemen, against Israel. We're talking about the Houthis here in Yemen that attack shipping, and obviously funding militias across Iraq and Syria. So from a strategic perspective, Iran isn't just seen as a hostile state. It's seen as a central node to a wider proxy network. Then there's also the question of timing. So regime change in Iran has been discussed for decades, but with these sort of things, always the risks outweigh the potential benefits. But what may look different now is that the perception that the system is less able to absorb shocks, so it is politically, economically, and socially a lot more vulnerable. Now, if the US did decide to use force, the objective definitely wouldn't be to destroy Iran. It would be to disrupt the regime's ability to control events inside Iran and across the region, across their proxy networks, while obviously limiting the risk to US forces and allies. And that usually means targeting systems rather than just symbols. So one likely focus would be the command and control systems and communication systems of the Iranian regime. And this allows the architecture to follow, send out orders, to coordinate, security services to respond appropriately. So when those links are degraded, even very large forces, which Iran does have at its disposal, but become slow and unresponsive. And this is where EW becomes particularly relevant, and even more so with a regime like Iran, and I'll explain why. When you look at traditional, I say traditional Western militaries, they are designed with a level of redundancy in mind. So authority is devolved to lower ranks. Junior leaders are trained to act on intent if communications fail. Authoritarian systems operate very differently. In highly centralized systems, communication is centralized, decision-making is centralized and highly controlled. Lower-ranking personnel often lack authority to act independently, and acting without orders can actually carry serious personal risk, which creates a vulnerability. So if communications are disrupted between units or from senior leadership, the system doesn't just slow down, it stalls, it stops completely. Forces wait, commanders hesitate, nothing becomes safer than doing the wrong thing because your head is on the block. And we saw this dynamic in Venezuela when the communications and air defense systems went offline. Low-ranking personnel reportedly did nothing once cut off from senior command. And we've seen similar patterns in Ukraine, where Russian command structures proved so centralized that senior officers, and we're talking about colonels and in some cases even generals, were forced close to the front line just to push decisions through, which is something you'll never see in Western militaries. And as evidence of this, we saw a lot of very senior Russian officers killed in combat. Iran's system shares many of these characteristics. Its military and security forces rely heavily on a centralized control and with political oversight. And this makes wide area EW especially powerful. You disrupt communications and coordinations, and you don't just degrade the military capability, you undermine the control of the entire system. So where does this leave us? Now, the deployment of the EA-37B doesn't necessarily mean that a strike is inevitable. Obviously, military planners prepare multiple options long before political decisions are made, and many moments that look decisive in hindsight turn out not to be, but this isn't routine either. Taken together, this, I think, explains why US planners would be thinking in terms of theater level EW rather than just narrowly focused tactical strikes or tactical EW, which would be carried out using the carrier's EW assets. Iran's potential responses are not just also limited to its own forces. They extend across a network of regional actors and asymmetric pressure points that rely heavily on coordination and communications. So in this context, wide area EW becomes strategically valuable, not just for supporting the initial strike, but also for degrading the ability of Iranian aligned actors in the region to coordinate retaliation across multiple theaters. Now, the kind of deployments that we're seeing may therefore be aimed at managing what comes after a strike as it is in enabling the strike itself. So buying time and space for US forces and allies in the region in the most volatile phase of the crisis. So when you take a step back and you look at the broader picture, the depth of Iran's internal crisis, the speed and the scale of the protests, the regime's increasingly blunt use of force just to try and hang on to power, the deterioration of its international standing, and the parallel shift in US military posture, it's clear that something has changed. At the very least, contingency planning appears to be moving into a more serious phase. EW assets like the EA-37B are not just about symbolism, they are the kind of capability that you position when you are thinking beyond a very limited or a purely symbolic strike, even if the final decision is yet to be taken. So whether the US decides to act now and how Iran responds if it does remains uncertain, but I think that whatever the next phases of this crisis, if we can call it that, will probably be a lot more consequential than the last. And that's why I think this particular deployment of this aircraft is actually so significant and worth paying attention to.